All right, Henry. I'm going to get this right this time. You're from New Zealand, so
That's right, New Zealand, not Australia.
I want to make certain I'm clear on that because I said Australia about 25 times since we started. New Zealand. So, what does a New Zealander think of this event?
Well, big golf tournament kind of came as a surprise to me. I didn't really know such a thing existed. You know, where I'm from, you might get 100,000 people turn out to a rugby game if you had a big enough stadium for sure, but not to watch golf.
Destiny. Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
All right, I'd like to welcome everybody back to New Frontiers. Now, first, the governor and I have a little bit of egg on our face. The last show that we had, we were talking about the Phoenix Open, what a great event it is. By the way, I still think it is an amazing event, but we had a lot of rain. Arizona's not used to a lot of rain. That in itself is an issue because I think both of us were talking about how we get this great publicity all over the country where you have these blue skies and everything looks sunny in Arizona, and businesses would call us. It rained almost the entire time. And that had another set of effects. We saw lots of drunkenness that was going on. We had some people who were out of control. One golfer, I don't remember what his name was, but literally when he was on his backstring, some fan yelled out and screamed at him, and he turned to the crowd and he said, "Dude, this is my job." That's creating a little bit of backlash for us. Governor, you have been involved in this issue forever. I'd love to have your input. And by the way, again, besides that, it still was a great event.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of the Waste Management Phoenix Open. It's an event that was put together to promote the Valley of the Sun through sports. It started in 1937. It's been over 80 plus opens, and you're right, we don't have much rain in Arizona. I think we get less than 6 inches a year, and this is one of those weeks where it was literally raining almost every day. I've been involved in the tournament for 24 years. They give you a rain suit on the day you're inducted. I had never had to wear my rain pants. I was proud of myself that I fit in them and I could find them. But it was, it's a stadium course. It was built for this event. It was built to have hundreds of thousands of people out there over the week with big crowds on Friday and Saturday. And with the rain, the stadium didn't hold up. It became slick and people were sliding down and falling. So I think there's going to be an adjustment that the group is going to have to make. I have real confidence in the leadership of the Thunderbirds, the charity board, the governance, but there are going to have to be some adjustments. And then also with such a large event, it's always been a golf tournament first and a party with a real purpose. But we have to understand that the golfers are out there. This is how they make their way. And I'll tell you, the golfers that are out there, they love this event. They enjoy the crowd. They enjoy the energy and the festivities, but they're there to play golf and to shoot the best score that they can, and fans will have to understand it and appreciate that. So it's probably a little bit of education that needs to be done on behalf of the Thunderbirds to make sure the fans understand how loved they are and what their role is, and that you can have fun, but you've got to let the golfers play the course properly.
Governor, you were talking about the origins of the event a moment ago and how it's turned into one of the biggest events of the year. Is that right?
Yes, this was put together by Bob and Barry Goldwater back in the 1930s, when in many ways, Phoenix was just starting out, kind of a backwater, and the whole objective of the organization is to promote the Valley of the Sun through sports. So it's been around a long time. It's had a lot of success, and the event has just grown tremendous. And I know for a period of time it was the largest sporting event in the world. I think there's now some Monte Carlo races over in Europe that go on for longer days that can claim that. But we do have hundreds of thousands of people out there over the 4 days, and well over a couple 100,000 people on course on Saturday. And normally, if it's a bright sunny day like it is today, it's pretty much without incident, but that wasn't the case with everybody being, pushed to the platforms and pavement on Saturday.
Do you have any idea what sort of changes they might make?
All right, Henry, I'm going to get this right this time. You're from New Zealand, so
that's right, New Zealand,
I want
not
to make sure
Australia.
I'm clear on that because I said Australia about 25 times since we started. New Zealand. So, what does a New Zealander think of this event?
Well, big golf tournament kind of came as a surprise to me. I didn't really know such a thing existed. Where I'm from, you might get 100,000 people turn out to a rugby game if you had a big enough stadium for sure, but not to watch golf. Although it does sound like the drunken melees, it sounds like maybe the Open was a little more similar to a rugby game this year, and so maybe the Kiwis might have liked it a little more than your regular Waste Management Open. Governor, what sort of changes do you think they might? What do you think they might implement? Changes for next year? Is there any indication?
Well, I think there will definitely be a policy around what happens when the weather's inclement, which is so rare out here. And then I think, like I said, I have a real confidence in the leadership and the executive council and the charities board, and they've got 356 days to fix this. The tournament's always been exciting and well attended, but it's reached some levels where I think this kind of thing has to be contemplated, and it's general admission tickets. I imagine, Paul, when you're out there, you're probably going to the 16th tee box or to the Bay Club.
Exactly.
If you have a venue, then problem really solved because we work with the fire marshal on that. But when you're talking more about the course is so expansive and can hold so many people. So we've got to find a way where general admission people can come in, and till very recently we just let general admission in. I think it still is free for first responders, military, police, and fire. We want the community to enjoy the event. It's always wildly successful. People have a great time over the course of the week, and then there's millions of dollars left over to give to children and family charities all here in Arizona. So it's a real jewel, and the issues that happened last week will be addressed. I'm certain of that.
Awesome. All right, so today we're going to focus on education. We're going to focus on a lot of different aspects of education. We're going to talk about our universities. We're going to talk about K-12 education, the role and the purpose. But I also want to talk about some of the reforms. Now, Arizona has been known for its reforms. I remember back in the 1990s, Symington did the charter school initiative. It was a huge reform, and we by the way, I might say, I might not have been a big supporter of it back in the 1990s, but it produced some amazing results. There's no doubt if you look at Basis or Great Hearts, Basis is scoring in the top of the country everywhere. In fact, for that matter, they have schools that are performing in the top of the world. The charter school movement began to give parents choices. Now, we also opened up vouchers, but we opened up vouchers to kind of a small group. I think they're called ESAs. This governor on this show actually was the lead of one of the reform efforts, probably the largest voucher program done anywhere in the country. And I want to start by talking about that and maybe asking some questions about it. But before we do, Governor, can you maybe tell us not only about the voucher program, but I'm really interested in knowing what problem were you trying to solve?
Thanks, Paul. I am very proud of the ESA program, Educational Savings Accounts. They're basically scholarships. Vouchers were actually deemed unconstitutional by our Supreme Court. So there was a way that you could address this where you could get dollars to the parents so they could make the choice. And this idea, which was an idea just in theory, in 2014 is what animated my run for governor. I really believe in this idea. I saw the power of what was happening in our charter schools. You know, Arizona is the #1 state in the country for charter schools. We have 525 charter schools. They house about 220,000 kids. That's nearly 20% of the children in Arizona. And if you take that cohort of kids, that's the #1 state in the country for achievement on math, reading, and science. And what ESAs are the next level of choice and innovation that opens it up for children and for families. Arizona was the first state to do this. 9 other states have followed. Tennessee and Texas are on the 1-yard line to get this done. And it's something that just brings the choice for the parent. I think that Milton Friedman is very eloquent on this. He talks about it in his Free to Choose series that you can watch on PBS or YouTube. But the person for me that was most persuasive was Condoleezza Rice. And she spoke out about this as an equality issue and a civil rights issue. So many of these kids are trapped in failing schools, and your future should not be determined by your zip code. And yes, we have some incredible K-12 district schools in Arizona, and we have open enrollment. But it was Janelle Wood who helped me get this over the finish line. Janelle ran the Black Mothers Forum. She came to see me during the George Floyd riots. She wasn't very happy that I called out the National Guard and had an 8 o'clock curfew and said, boy, I wish there was a issue we could agree on, Governor. I found out Janelle had a real heart for school choice. She sat next to Angela Ducey in my final State of the State, and I said from the podium that 50 years ago, politicians stood in the schoolhouse door and wouldn't let minorities in. Today, politicians stand in the schoolhouse door and won't let minorities out. These kids are trapped in failing public schools. It's time to set these families free. Janelle Wood led the standing ovation. She organized the African-American pastors to whip the votes. We passed this in Arizona, Paul, by 1 vote in the House and 1 vote in the Senate. Not one of them a Democrat vote. But Janelle Wood and all those African-American pastors are registered Democrats. This isn't a partisan issue. This is about opportunity for our families across the state. Arizona's leading the way. There's more to do, but we're off to a fast start.
Okay, so let me ask some questions. And by the way, I want to give a few disclosures here. I probably started off when you and I talked about this a week or 2 ago about putting this on, I started out pretty negative. There are some things that I found about this that I genuinely like. I also saw some things that were questions that I think need to be answered. Now, the questions, maybe, I don't think that you have to, when you pass a program, answer all the questions up front. Sometimes you figure out the problems as you go and you make adjustments for them. But I'd love to know what your thoughts are on the challenges that we face. By the way, let me tell you what I liked.
Sure.
I really do like the idea of giving parents a choice. And I really do think that sometimes we're a bit elitist when the only people who have choices are the people with money. I don't think that that's necessarily fair. The second thing that I like is I like improving the standard. And I do believe, just as a free market type, that competition eventually will lead to better products out of both groups. All right. Now, here are the challenges. And I'm just going to lump all 3 of these together because I'll give you your ability and space to be able to answer them the way that you want. But all of them revolve around the data and then how we would react to the data. What standard should we put in place to figure out what's taking place with what data we may find? The first area where I found that we didn't have much data was on the idea of, are we really getting poor parents to take their children and put them into private schools? Now, to me, that's data that we should collect, and I know that we have some idea, but it seems like that's data that we should collect so that we can know, are we doing the job that we need to be doing? The second area is it improving the actual standard? And my concern with that is, I don't believe, I could be wrong on this, I don't believe that we're applying any type of testing to the students who are in these programs to make certain that they're achieving at a minimum level. Now, that may be fair of our public schools as well, but nonetheless, that's number two. And the third one is fraud. The idea that, a parent could be, well, I actually know a parent who had their 4 or 5 children. They're in the low-income area, so the good news is they're actually going to use the system. They took all of their children out. They're doing a homeschooling. But then the question becomes, one, is the student actually performing well, and are they committing fraud, meaning not really giving them the education that they want and utilizing it? So anyway, I'd love to hear kind of your response to that. And again, I don't necessarily think you had to have all the problems fixed up front. Maybe these are problems that get fixed over time, but I'd still like to hear your input on them.
For sure. And I'm happy to answer these questions. Listen, Paul, this is part of the public policy process. I mean, we had to get the votes on this. It took all of 8 years to get these votes. And I really think there's some divine intervention in the last year, because it didn't look like it had any chance. There were some hard no's in the Republican conference. So that's why I give the credit to Janelle Wood and the African-American pastors and other people that helped step up, because we got it over the finish line, and I'm excited about it. And so I'm going to give you kind of the concise answers to these questions so we can keep moving along, but feel free to follow up on this. First of all, you're right. At least the evidence is in terms of choice and competition. I bragged on Arizona charters. You mentioned Basis and Great Hearts. Great Hearts had a 13,000 kid wait list in 2016. I mean, those are parents saying, I want a more rigorous education. Amanda Ripley called Basis the best education in the world in her book, The Smartest Kids in the World. And ESAs were the next iteration of this idea of choice inside the portfolio. But while charters were improving, so were our traditional K-12 district schools. So it was that rising tide that lifted all boats, and I'm confident that ESAs will do the same. Now, they're just starting out. So when you say, how do we know that we're getting new kids? Well, when this program started, I think we had 13,000 kids using ESAs. Now we're somewhere near 70,000 families, and they're budgeting for 100,000 families. And yes, some of the parents were already in Catholic or private school, but we've brought new parents to this, parents that could not afford it or needed the scholarship for the last mile to get there, and there's evidence of that as well. We also know, and I want to double check these numbers, I think the average income in Arizona is around $67,000, and the average ESA parent is at $60,000. So these are underserved folks. These are folks that are not in the top quintile. These are people that need assistance. In terms of improving the standards and talking about the tests, we've had a lot of fights around standardized testing, Common Core, et cetera. American K-12 education has been flatlining since the 1980s, and all we've done is heap on more tests. So we did not add testing to this. I really believe the accountability is with the parent. Parents know if their child is being challenged. They know if they're in the right spot. They know if they need a change of scenery. That doesn't mean that there won't be things added later, but I really wanted to, with charters, we were called the Wild West. Almost anybody could charter a school in Arizona, and there were some misses along the way. But without those misses, we would have never gotten the great academies that we have here that are now going to other places around the country. So I did, if there was a silver lining in COVID-19, it was that we were able to get this done. We passed much more limited ESA legislation in 2017. It was only 5,000 kids a year, and it was nobody that was already in a private school. That was referred to the ballot, and it was crushed by the voters in 2017. This came to the legislature in 2022, post-COVID, after parents saw over these screens the lack of rigor and real challenge that was happening at the ground level, and the amount of indoctrination and other things that were being talked about beyond reading and writing and analyzing numbers. And not only did we get it through the legislature, they couldn't even get the signatures to refer this to the ballot. So this is an idea whose time has come, and I think the fact, I've used the analogy of Roger Bannister. Folks, you're and our age will understand. Nobody thought that the 4-minute mile could ever be broken by any human being. Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile, and within months, hundreds of people, now thousands of people, have broken the 4-minute mile. I don't know that anyone thought universal ESAs could happen. They happen in Arizona. Now we've got 9 other states, with Texas and Tennessee soon to follow. And lastly, fraud. So this is important. We don't want fraud. We want these funds used for education. We're using technologies like Student Wallet to help protect the program, but it's important that we have transparency and fidelity to what the purpose is. I think we're going to try to avoid it at all costs. I pulled up some information from the Auditor General, and this program's been around since 2010. It's much more expansive today than it was then. But according to the Auditor General, the rate of apparent misuse of ESA funds is at 1%. Okay, now let's look at that in comparison to some other comparable programs. Misuse of SNAP benefits is 11%. Misuse of Medicaid benefits is at 15%, and misuse of unemployment benefits is at 22%. Now, we want to do everything we can to avoid misuse in ESAs. We read every now and again in the Arizona Republic about some chief financial officer for the Scottsdale Unified School District that embezzled funds from the school. This stuff happens, and it's hard to avoid what a bad parent will do. But a bad parent probably isn't putting a child in a position where they're getting a good education to begin with. And I think having the misuse of funds at 1% right now, when this has been around for more than a decade, is a positive sign.
So talk to me about the budget. What effect is this going to have on the budget itself?
So the traditional kid in Arizona, when you take property tax, state tax, all the waterfall things, Prop 301, the Permanent Land Endowment Trust Fund, it costs about $15,000, or there's about $15,000 per child available when they go into a district K-12 seat. So if a kid's in there on day one in a district K-12, and then they're at that same seat on day 100, that school gets $15,000 from the general fund. If a child opts out of that and wants to go where my kids went to school, we were in the diocesan Catholic school district, that kid gets $7,500 approximately. So half the amount of money is spent on the child that chooses a different path than the existing path. Charters get about $11,000. So the folks that get the most money are the traditional district K-12, and a lot of parents are very happy with that district K-12. And if they're doing a good job, they're going to be just fine. But they don't lose anything when a child chooses to go somewhere else. They just need to get another child to come into that seat, and in a growing state, that's not a problem.
So one of the things that I find to be interesting, and this is one of the things that I really dwelled upon, today you have a system with some people who are outside the system, some people who are inside the system, but we all get a vote on education. I personally think there is no bigger, greater issue than we have in our community, in economic development, in income disparity, than education. It far and away is one of the most important things that we need to do. I'd probably put that and entrepreneurship right up at the top. Now, when people are outside of the system, they have an incentive to vote against education. When people are inside the system, they have an incentive to vote for education. The idea that you're bringing in all parents, even if a large portion of them are wealthy, one of the things I think that it's going to do is to create a coalition of support in the future for more funding for education. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I push back a little bit. I definitely agree. At the state level, education is the number one issue, and not just in Arizona, across all 50 states. If you look at states' spending or investment, I'd like to think of it in Arizona, it's over 50% on education, especially when you include universities. So this is the equivalent of what national defense is at the federal level. At the state level, there's no larger issue. And I think education can make the biggest difference in a child's life beyond their family. Okay, I still do think someone born into a loving family with an adult who cares for them is going to make all the difference, even if they're below the poverty line. And if then they have access to education, Condoleezza Rice tells this incredible story about what it was like growing up as a young black child in Alabama during civil rights. And that I think both her parents were school teachers, so it wasn't like they were from incredible means, but she did go to an excellent school. And it was a public school, and it allowed her to become Secretary of State, to consult with the president, to even be encouraged to run for president. And we need to provide that opportunity to all of our children. And this is what I think ESAs can help us achieve. I also would say I think Americans are pretty generous. I mean, most education issues that come to the ballot, people vote yes. I mean, in many ways, I think that the government unions were misusing that big-heartedness of Americans by always saying it's for the children, it's for the children. And then we look back over 30 or 40 years, and the children aren't getting very much. The children aren't learning very much. And, you know, the teachers that work inside these classrooms are incredible people. And they're not making very much in comparison to how much we have put into K-12 education. So I think, you know, with ESAs, you're going to have a way to bring that entrepreneurial spirit to education. We've seen breakthroughs like what Salman Khan has done with Khan Academy. I think we'll see 1,000 flowers bloom in terms of innovation, but now you'll have parents really in charge of their children's education and having real options, not only about excellence in terms of some of the charters that we're talking about, but think about a kid that's getting bullied or a kid that made a mistake on social media, on something they posted, somebody who wants a fresh start. I just think giving the parent that flexibility is so important. You know, we never challenge somebody when they say, oh, I'm going off to the East Coast for college. We don't say, hey, you should stay here and you're not allowed to go elsewhere for college or community college or even trade school. But we've got this mindset that you've got to go down the street for grade school and high school, and the down the street grade schools and high schools are excellent in many parts of the state, but where they're not working or they're not right for a child, let's give the parent an option and let's let the marketplace show us what magic and innovations they can provide.
All right, so I'm going to challenge this a little bit, and I'd love to hear the pushback on where maybe I'm looking at this wrong. So I look at education, and to me, there are 5 things that are important in education. Certainly, you have to have adequate funding. You could argue what adequate funding is, but you have to have adequate funding for it. The second issue that is important, Bill Gates did a great study where he talked about schools that were the most successful. And in general, he said the schools that were the most successful had superintendents who had a vision for what it was that they wanted to do, and they got the faculty bought in. He actually said what the vision was less important than the fact that they bought other people into it and got everyone on the same page. The third area that I think is important is that people have choices. I think that with choices comes competition. Competition, I think, is always a good thing. I genuinely believe that. I then think you need to have teachers in control of their classrooms. And there are a lot of reasons why I think teachers aren't in control of their classrooms oftentimes. Even the issues that relate to special education sometimes can allow a disruptive student to be able to get out of control inside a classroom, and the teacher ends up being boxed in. I think class sizes that are too large. I don't know where the right size is. I don't know if it's 20 or 30 or 35, but at some point it becomes more difficult for the teacher to control the class itself. But the last issue, and this is the one that you might give pushback on, you can give pushback on any of them if you'd like to, and Henry, you certainly can as well. I think testing is the key. Now, I agree with you. Common Core seemed to be a misguided experiment. It didn't seem to work out well. But there are national standard tests that are important. That question to me is about whether or not government has the right to say, these are values that we see as being important. Now, I put a big value in today's society on science and math. I think it's important. But I also know that not every student is going to be a STEM student, that some of them are going to focus more on liberal arts, and that's going to be important. But we on civics education, I think that there's a reason for us to be giving civics education. This isn't to pan the voucher program, because I know that they have some standards or some things that they require that the student must be taught. But to me, the testing is key. Without some type of test, it's really hard to know whether or not you're getting the results.
So I want to let Henry go. I will push back on some of this and tell you where I agree. But Henry, feel free to chime in on your thoughts here.
I agree with Paul actually on testing. I think that without some sort of standardized testing that's widely applied, it's very, very difficult to gauge the success of any student, any teacher, and to have accountability at any level, including for the students and for the parents, right? So I agree with you on the importance of testing. I had a question for Governor Ducey, though, about the reforms that have happened here in Arizona, which all have been very interesting to me, because I come from a country that has no charter schools whatsoever, no school choice whatsoever, apart from for the very rich who can afford to go to the very small number of very expensive private schools in the big cities. And so all this is very new to me. I was very intrigued by the school choice movement here, and I've come to learn quite a lot about it, and to learn that although Arizona is underperforming the nation in school completion, standardized test results and things across the board, that, as you said, Governor Ducey, that the charter schools are among the bright spots. And I even see that at the university at Arizona State, that a lot of my best students say that they've gone to some form of a charter school, and there seem to be a lot of charter schools that are doing well. You mentioned Great Hearts and Basis, but there have been others that I've had some of my best students go to as well. But the reforms that seem to have happened up till now seem to be promoting demand, right? So school choice on the part of the parents promotes demand for alternative schools. But it seems like there's not as many mechanisms in place to ensure supply, right? And the traditional schools, it seems, are at an advantage because they've got all the facilities that have been built up over decades by the school districts. They've got the sports fields, they've got the buildings, they've got bonds that they can levy on the property in the local school district. And my impression is that's not the same everywhere, and that, for example, in New York, as I learned from Thomas Sowell's work, where he studied schools that were actually co-located, district schools and charter schools in the same building, it seems that in New York and in other places, they sort of force the school districts, if the occupancy of a school gets below a certain point, to hand some of it over, or to allow charters to lease it from the school districts. Do you think that's the next step for school choice in Arizona, is to unleash some of the supply constraints, maybe on the capital investment side, right? You have these startups, these charter schools, and they can't issue bonds. Maybe they could raise money from shareholders on the capital markets. I'm not sure. They could get donations from private philanthropy, and et cetera. But maybe that is the next step to enable them to get access to some of these resources that are kind of locked up, especially the brick and mortar type things.
Great question. Great question. So there's a lot here. I'm going to handle it almost like a lightning round and just tick down here, because of all the stuff brought up in the last segment. First, on funding, of course. Funding's important. Paul, America spends more on education than any other country in the world. We've tripled it in the last several decades. I think we're not spending the dollars effectively. I think it's going to overhead and bureaucracy, and we're building monuments in many of these new places. You need a good teacher in the front of the classroom. That makes the biggest difference, and we need more people going into teaching, but that's all I'm going to say on funding. You said superintendents make the difference. I'm not going to push back on that, but my experience, whenever I saw a great school, and there's many of them in Arizona, what was the difference was the principal. And great teachers follow great principals, and great principals know how to run a school, reward a teacher, and they know how to help and support the teacher keep control of the classroom. So that was my experience. I guess you could go to the next level up in management and saying great superintendents attract principals, but I definitely
Governor,
saw that all over the state.
Just a small interruption, and that is, actually, that's what Bill Gates said. I said superintendent. He said superintendent and principals. So I think he would have agreed with you.
So I'm listening to you, Paul. I'm listening. And then on testing, I am in agreement that a test is how we tell what you know. There's a lot of people that are anti-testing. And when I ran for office, I was pushing back and said, I just did the job of treasurer. Was it important to you that I showed you the budget and that you had access to it? Or could I just said the budget's fine? I mean, the way this works is testing is a measure. I think we've got to do something around it where it's not standardized, where the parent has charge over it. And some kids are not good test takers. Yeah, and they're visual learners. There's other issues to this, but I don't want to quibble about that. Now, you talked, Henry, about Arizona scores. There's growth and proficiency. Arizona is leading the nation in terms of growth in math and reading. It's not where it should be on proficiency, but I want to give you this stat because he's a good friend of mine, and we were both invited to a world forum in our first year as governor. I was there to talk about how to grow an economy, and Charlie Baker was there as the governor of Massachusetts to talk about education. Massachusetts is the #1 state in America for education. So when you say we're not ranked that well, who we're chasing is Massachusetts. Well, Massachusetts at 12th grade has 50% of its kids at reading level.
Wow.
That's #1. I think that's unacceptable. So I think many of the things we're measuring are not what's important. And when you talked about what's happening in New York, that was actually begun by Michael Bloomberg. And I forget the superintendent, but he was the guy that tried to break up Microsoft. He just doesn't like monopolies. He's a left-winger. He's a Democrat. His name will come to me, and we can put it in the show notes. He wanted to break up the public school monopoly because he thought these kids were trapped. They document a lot of this in a great movie called Waiting for Superman.
Terrific movie.
You can watch it for free on YouTube. But the issue here is, yes, I wholeheartedly agree with what you suggested around district schools when they're losing population. Can they be converted or rechartered and bring in a new operator, a new principal, a new culture that attracts parents and has rigor and challenge and meets the needs of the kids? I say government union. When I say that, I mean teachers union, but I'm always going to be supportive of the teachers. I don't think the teachers union is supportive oftentimes of the teachers or of standards in education, because they're the ones that block this at every turn in terms of allowing kids choice to move out of a school and allowing the recharterization or the new face or allowing a kid to escape a failing school. You know, if a charter fails over 3 years, it's shut down. It's out of business. I want you to point to me the last district K-12 school that was shut down in Arizona.
Yeah, and by the way, I think that's a huge issue. One of the things I recall in my campaign was in taking a look at schools. There's no doubt there are schools in Arizona that if your kid goes to them, they have about a 70% chance of not graduating from high school. Ensuring that those schools are shut down or that there's some type of replacement put into place that would ensure that those kids can graduate is important. Governor, you're doing a great job at defending this, so I hate to keep you under fire, but I'm gonna do a couple of more if you don't mind. So the now this was before you were in office, but there was a movement afoot at one point in time to do a consolidation of school districts. I think we have over 200 school districts in Arizona. Marty Schultz, I recall, was one of the big advocates for that program years ago.
Yes.
And in that program, he pointed out that if we did a consolidation of those districts, we would see a significant savings. In fact, I think he said over $1 billion would be saved by consolidation. One of the interesting facts that came up was in New Orleans, when the flood took place, Katrina, all the schools closed, and they literally could only open up one. Well, from that point, almost every school became a charter school, and they got rid of all the administration that was over top of it. You had made a mention a moment ago, something along the line of trying to get the dollars into the classroom with the teachers where it belongs. Why is it that we can't get school consolidation to take place? And is it even a worthy idea in your mind?
So it's a good idea, and Marty Schultz did an excellent job trying to present it. It's confusing, so the people rejected it. I think we have 235 school districts in Arizona. That seems to me like way too many. We only have 15 counties. But I also want you to know that that's just not the answer. You can have one big school district, and it can be really bad. Like think of LA Unified. I would say at some points think of Tucson Unified School District. That's just one school district of, and there's 234 more. So it's not just the consolidation. We were able to address a lot of this, Paul, because what you have is you have replication and duplication in terms of transportation, in terms of maintenance, in terms of janitorial, in terms of food service and cafeteria. So through statute, we were able to allow districts to consolidate those contracts. And we were able to drive some of the cost out and drive the savings into the classroom and away from the bureaucracy and the administration. So I think as you're presenting it, yeah, there's an easier way to do this. There's a way to simplify it. But what we're trying to do is to make sure that those dollars are getting to the classroom and not elsewhere. A lot of the statutes that have been able to be written since Marty tried that at the ballot box were done in the last 8 years and have provided more dollars in the right spots.
Yeah, that seems to me to be a key, because the thing that you mentioned about us spending more money than anywhere else in the world, I think a lot of Americans hear that and they feel like we're not spending our money efficiently, and showing them that we can is important. I also know from being in government that a lot of times you can work your butt off making those types of improvements and nobody notices. So they just keep saying the same thing. Henry, this question's for you, and this is about the role that we should play in ensuring that our children are educated correctly. What I want to try to address is Emily and I wrote this book, Addictive Ideologies, and we studied genocides that happened all over the world. One of the places that we studied was Rwanda. Now, when the genocide happened in Rwanda, one of the fascinating things was that you had these two tribes, the Hutus and the Tutsis, which were both black tribes, but the tribes began to have this belief that they were different races. What we actually now know that happened was the Germans began to separate out them based upon the size of the nose, the size of the ears, that type of thing. The Belgians continued that type of a program, and the people who looked more European were the ones that ended up working in the homes, and the others worked outside of it. But the school system promoted the concepts that there was racism that had taken place on a large level, and more importantly, that the Hutus were being discriminated against, that they were being harmed by the Tutsis. There's no doubt now, and looking back on that, the historians that have looked at it, the educational system played a huge role in sparking that genocide, of taking one group of people, separating them further, and giving them animosity and angst. Now, we're seeing in our schools, one of the things that's certainly on podcasts throughout the country, is this concept that we have an educational system that seems to be intentionally driving a separation of people based upon the postmodernist or post-colonialist types of ideas that have been imported from France and other places. it seems as if, I don't know if this is accurate, but it seems as if we're not giving them a good enough education on capitalism, the free markets, on the history of the United States. You're a history professor. I'd love kind of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, the history of Rwanda that you mentioned and the genocide in Rwanda, the historical background to that is quite familiar to me from some of the work that I did as an undergraduate. And also, I studied in Germany for a long time, so I know about the sort of the construction of racial differences, perpetuation of that kind of racism, and the way that it led to the genocide against the Jews in Europe committed by the Nazi regime, right? And so it's true that historically some of these divisive ideas around race have led to absolutely terrible outcomes. I teach classes in political economy at Arizona State, and I teach, the history of economic development, ideas around economic development. And one of the striking things about teaching that material is that you can point to successes and failures from all sorts of different cultures. So if you want to look at one of the most incredible stories of economic development and unlikely stories, you just have to look at South Korea. In the wake of World War II, South Korea was really, really underdeveloped, one of the poorest countries in the world, poorer than places like Kenya, right? And even in the 50s, it was even amazingly poorer than communist North Korea for a long time. But then through various reforms and eventually the country emerged from a military dictatorship to become a democracy at the end of the 80s. But basically through this kind of free market system, although the South Korean case is very, very sort of specific, but in any case, through something we could recognize as some sort of capitalist free market economy, South Korea is now one of the richest countries in the world, right? So when you start to look at the examples of where economic development occurs, where it doesn't, the factors that really impede economic development, they just really don't correspond to any sort of model of racial difference, especially not racial difference. They really correspond essentially to political institutions, and where you have a basic set of political institutions that allow for private property rights, some sort of accountability, constraints on the government so they're not wantonly, taxing the citizens, stealing property from them, giving them absolutely no say in who runs the country, then you tend to get economic development. And when you don't have those things, you tend not to. So you're right. There are a lot of alternative models of why some countries become rich. A lot, many of them, you call them sort of neo-Marxist. They focus on the exploitation of the poor by the rich, or the exploitation of one minority group by another. But the basic reality is that when you sort of line them up against the empirical evidence, those models are, they don't really explain very much, is the simple truth. Now, those models are still being taught at our universities, and I'm sure you can take a bunch of classes on those sorts of theories of economic development and politics at Arizona State the same way you can anywhere else. But in mainstream economics and political economy, they're pretty much totally discredited. So it's, I guess you could say it's the marketplace of ideas, and you could ask yourself why it is that some of these discredited ideas are still hanging around out there, but it's not really a controversial statement as a social scientist to say that these ideas just don't really hold any water.
All right. So one of the things that we've seen is that ASU has a very good fire rating, but this whole idea of heterodoxy, the idea that you can have college professors who are able to present differing ideas. Steven Pinker, who's been on our show, talks about this issue, and he's fascinating in it. He, as a cognitive psychologist who focuses on behavior, he wrote this book, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago. It's called Blank Slate. And in the book Blank Slate, he advocated that there is a difference between men and women, that we're born with some differences. Now, he presented the data on that. It's very funny because Larry Summers, who was also on the program, Larry supported him, said, no, if that's what you're going to do, go ahead and do it. Well, when they got done, they wanted to fire Larry and not Steve Pinker, but Larry tells a very funny story about that. But the point was that Stephen makes is, look, maybe my idea is wrong. Maybe my theory is wrong. But that doesn't mean you should stop it. That means that you should present new data, not utilize cancel culture or other means to try and stop it. That these ideas have to be able to confront other ideas, and that's what universities are supposed to do. Your experience so far at ASU, Is there more of an environment where you can have a difference of opinion and differing ideas, or is there an orthodoxy that's beginning to take form there as well?
I think much less than at other places. And I think a lot of it has to do with the sheer scale of the institution, to be perfectly honest. ASU is so big, the student body is so diverse, the faculty body is so huge and diverse. There are people working on all sorts of different ideas across the campus, and I'm not even sure that many of their colleagues really are aware of it, to be honest, right? And so I think it's less of a kind of intellectual hothouse than other places. You know, my position before I came to ASU, I actually had a 3-year postdoc at Oxford University in the UK, which is a small private university. Well, it's not that small, but it's a private university comprised of these very small colleges. And I think there's something like 36 colleges that make up the university. And of course, each college has its own student body and its own faculty. And some of them might only have 3 or 4 political scientists and then 3 or 4 hard scientists and things. They're very small communities. So everyone knows each other very well. The classes are extremely small. And there was much, much more of a political orthodoxy and an intellectual orthodoxy being imposed in that institution than there is at ASU, I think, because of the very, very small personalized nature of the interactions among students and faculty. And, you know, the president of ASU, Michael Crow, one of the things he likes to say, and I think it's a good line, is that the entire student body of all the Ivy League could fit in the football stadium of the University of Michigan. They could probably fit in the football stadium at ASU too. So we're talking about small communities, very, very powerful communities because of the intellectual elites that are generated by the Harvards and the Princetons and Yales of the world, and also the economic elites, right? A lot of their graduates go on to make a lot of money. So they're very powerful, but very, very small groups of people. And so I think that one of the things about big public universities, and apart from my stint at Oxford, I've always been at big public universities my whole career, is there's just more space for people to find their niche, to go about their business, and there's just much, much less ability for any one group to impose their views on the institution as a whole, which I think is probably a good thing overall. And I think, you know, to go back to the University of Oxford example, one of the reasons why that university has survived and thrived for hundreds of years, or actually over 1,000 years, is because of the structure I mentioned, the small colleges. Some of the colleges would go broke almost, you know, they would be dysfunctional. They would have bad ideas being generated there, but then others would be doing well. And interestingly enough, that's kind of what I think you see at a big public university these days, is more competition, more diversity of ideas and people across the institution, that I think is probably a pretty good thing.
Governor, the universities play a huge role in economic development. One of the things that we just saw in talking to businesses all over the country during the time I was mayor was, you know, you could see how Stanford as well as MIT had played huge roles in the development of their local communities. I'm interested in knowing your thoughts. I think both of us are big supporters of our universities here in Arizona. I think Dr. Crow has done a great job, but it's become a massive organization. In your time in being governor, would your view be that that's the right direction? I know Bob Robb, who was on our show about a month ago, he likes to talk about the importance of smaller institutions, but I'd love your thoughts on this and the role that you think universities play on economic development, as well as the concepts that Henry was talking about a moment ago, which is the role in trying to understand how free markets work.
I think over the past 8 years, Arizona led the nation in terms of economic development and what we were able to bring to our state. And Michael Crow was a MVP on every front, not only as a full equity partner in the state of Arizona, but in what he's done with the university to prepare young people to become engineers, to go to business school, and to be ready right from day one to go in these organizations. So whether it was Infosys or Taiwan Semi or Nikola or Lucid, the expansion of Raytheon had a lot to do with what was going on with U of A. So to me, Michael's vision was a new American university. And you might say that it's massive, but Paul, it was massive when I was there. in 1982. It's much more massive. I think Michael has kept the promise and the commitment both to the community and to the students. And to Henry's point, I do think there's a marketplace of ideas at ASU. And there should be more of a marketplace of ideas at all of our universities. It seems in many of these places there's just a marketplace of bad ideas, and they will not allow other ideas in. I saw Larry Summers, you brought his name up. I saw him speak at some event, and somebody was asking him, why aren't there more conservatives in the Ivy Leagues? Why aren't there more universities teaching at colleges? And he said, well, hey, there's a cohort of people in the nation that don't like the country and despise the economic system, and they either go into academia or the press. So that's how I answer the question. It got a good laugh. But I think that what you see at ASU with Skettle and with competing ideas and with University of Chicago or monetary type economics, you're getting from Keynesian to what I would think are the better ideas, and then let the students decide. And I want to close this point by saying this, to me, is what's so important about school choice. I don't know how these DEI ideas crept into our university and some of these woke ideologies, but when parents see it, many of them are going to reject it, and they'll have a choice in where to go. I think Michael Crow provides that choice writ large at the public university level. I think the kids are competing at the same level of kids at what are considered elite universities who are out there protesting and marching in support of Hamas. And I think you've mentioned before, Paul, Bill Maher's Real-Time show. I wanted to point a clip out from this last Friday because I'd never heard of this gentleman, Coleman Hughes. He is an African-American man who I think went to Columbia, and he wrote a book called The End of Race Politics. And he talks about how this division, Martin Luther King's vision was that we'd be known by the content of our character and not the color of our skin. But for 20 plus years, 30 plus years, this has crept in where we identify ourselves from where our ancestor came or what, shade of color we have in our skin. And I think the evidence is in, it's not working. It's dividing us. And he makes a much more eloquent case for it in the opening segment for Bill Maher. But to me, it's the first time in decades where you're seeing the pendulum swing back to center. It wasn't that long ago that you heard those chants, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go. I think that started on Stanford campus. William F. Buckley wrote decades before that, God and Man at Yale. We want our universities to be what I think you see happening in the state of Arizona, where you have the full spectrum under the sun, and let these ideas compete. Let's not cancel people that want to come and present an idea. And I think it's part of the reason that people are flocking to our state.
The Coleman did a great job. I don't know if you've seen his TED Talk, but in his TED Talk, he gave this presentation about color blindness. What his whole point was to return to that era inside of our country's history. By the way, he's African American, where we don't utilize the color of someone's skin to judge them. And he talked about how that was kind of a predominant thought in the 1960s. If you watch the show, he's not confrontational to anyone. It's not even in his personality to be confrontational. Well, when they were done, some of the staff at TED got upset, and literally they attempted to cancel him. It took him months. It took them months to put the show up, and they actually asked him if he would just kind of walk away, and he said, no, you can decide not to put me up, but I'm not going to just walk away. If you guys have decided that this is a point of view that you don't want to have heard, that's up to you. I look at this DEI issue. Again, Bob gave a good description of how merit needs to play a role. I believe diversity, there is a value to diversity, but I also believe that merit needs to be at the front end. What I see that's going on with our universities, I found this whole debate on affirmative action with Harvard and the Ivy League schools fascinating, because their argument is, hey, there's only a select amount of people that are going to be able to make it in, and we need to make certain that the staff is diverse. What Dr. Crow talks about is that according to I think it was an Obama study, by 2030, we're going to have to increase from now until then about a 70 percentile on attainment rates, meaning every university in the country needs to find a way to bring in more students. Now, ASU is working on doing that. But the question for the Harvard and the Yales and the Princeton is, why not you? And their answer is, well, we want to be exclusive. Well, our population is growing, and they're not keeping up anywhere near with population growth. And they could be doing it through a lot of different means, through electronic type classes. There's lots of ways to make their degree more efficient and include more people in the process and broaden out the spectrum.
Why are we worried about that? They're private universities. This is where they've chosen to be. You saw how their president spoke to the people of America and Congress. You know, Larry Summers made this point in his interview, please put it in the show notes, at the All-In Conference. He said, if you have an institution or a product that had the brand of Harvard or Stanford, do you think you might have expanded the market share over the last 150 years? Yet they have not. They're that same size, and they are known by the people they reject, the people they exclude. I think this is the greatest case for what Michael Crow has done at Arizona State University. Is he is not measured by who he excludes. This is true inclusiveness, and it is based on merit. And this idea of diversity, yes, I'm pro-diversity. I'm also pro-diversity of ideas. And I think you see in some of these elite institutions, we should probably quit burdening that word, which used to mean something. You do not have a diversity of ideas. You know, it was Larry Summers who told me he thought there should be a constitutional course taught at Harvard, and his only ally was Harvey Mansfield, who is the, I think, last living conservative on campus who's in his 90s. But what's wrong with our kids understanding the founding documents? The way you improve things in America is to do it through democracy. They certainly like to invoke democracy a lot, and I think that's really a way to try to sell majority rules rather than going through our, constitutional republic system of government. Where you can get things done, and the majority traditionally gets what it wants. But I think all this discussion on what's going on at these institutions that are run by 12 people at Harvard, if they want to make an adjustment, they can do it tomorrow. They've chosen not to. And I think this was the first year that they saw a reduction in applications for admission. So the market is working. And really smart kids are voting with their feet. And I hope they're coming to Arizona State University.
You and me both.
Governor, I think to your point, there is an important dynamic going on here that is not necessarily visible to the outside. You talk about how small these universities are, and therefore it doesn't really matter what they do. And they are small in terms of their undergraduate classes. You also ask yourself, why aren't they changing and expanding them? And it's because they actually have as many graduate students, or maybe more graduate students than undergraduates. And those graduate students invariably go on to all of the prestigious faculty positions in all of the universities in the country, including places like Arizona State. So it matters what they're teaching at these universities more for the graduate students than for the undergrads, because the graduate students go on to teach the undergrads everywhere else at a much greater scale. And the reason why they're not expanding their undergraduate education is because the Harvards and Princetons and Yales of the world, they know that that's where they're having their influence. Why would a Harvard professor agree to teach a 150 student section when he doesn't care about undergraduate education? He is focused on the 15 to 20 PhD students that he wants to train and get good jobs so that his ideas go out into universities and are therefore taught to thousands of undergraduates across the country. And so it does matter what they're doing, but it matters way more at the graduate level. And that is where a place like Arizona State really struggles, because our PhD programs are underfunded, under-resourced, and to be frank, not very good. ASU doesn't have a single PhD program ranked above about 40th in the nation. Our PhD students, whether they're in political science, where I teach, or in history or engineering, they therefore struggle to get faculty jobs. And so the places where there's more intellectual diversity in the academy are not sending professors out to teach those diverse ideas. The professors that are getting sent out are coming from the places with the big endowments that can do the very expensive work of PhD training, and that's why what they do matters. Now, I never went to a private university. I was lucky enough to make my way through public university all the way and still get a faculty job, and I now have tenure and I can teach, right? But there are going to be fewer and fewer people like me that have that background, and more people from places like Harvard as the financial situation of the public universities declines. And I think this is one part of the equation that it's really opaque from the outside. People don't understand this part of the political economy of higher ed and why it matters so much what's going on at these private universities. And so, yes, it's true that ASU is doing a good job of educating a lot of students at a reasonably good level, and for many of them at relatively low cost. But we are not training graduate students and getting them faculty positions. And that might not matter to the people of Arizona, and I can see why they wouldn't care. But it does matter across the entire higher education landscape when all the universities like Arizona State are no longer doing that, because you won't have the same diversity of ideas across the entire system.
So how do you remedy that, Henry?
I think that what has to happen, to be frank, is that there's going to have to be private investment in sort of small graduate programs across the country outside of the Ivy League, because I don't think that the public universities are going to be able to fund these graduate programs through their regular financing mechanisms. We're already seeing at places like ASU that our graduate student cohorts are shrinking. I went to the University of Minnesota, which at the time was ranked sort of in the top 20, right, of the PhD programs for political science in the country. And even our program was close to being eliminated. It was being run at the lowest level that was sustainable in terms of the number of students to get enough students in the seminars. So I think that what's going to have to happen is this issue has to be brought to people's attention, and we need to get funding specifically for graduate programs, not for undergraduate programs. And we have to have a pipeline of more diverse ideas into the professoriate through PhD programs all across the country, not just at the very, very elite. There are other ways of doing it. There are places like the Institute for Humane Studies that are doing it slightly different way, which is they target more intellectually diverse or conservative graduate students across the country and give them extra funding to try and keep them in the system to get them faculty jobs. I think that's promising, and it's been relatively successful in the past. I think that could work as well. But I think that there needs to be more attention to this issue of the graduate pipeline and diversity, intellectual diversity in the graduate pipeline.
You know, I've been around these issues for some time. I knew none of that. I think you're making a great case. I don't think a lot of donors understand that either. I mean, you saw Paul Griffin, Ken Griffin, ask for his money back from Harvard. I think he committed $400 million, and he said, no more. I'm taking my money elsewhere. I thought that was more around the Hamas protest and what President Gay had said. But a lot of these people are giving their money. They're going to fund what you said in terms of a lack of diversity around ideas. And I think a lot of donors, if they knew that it was going to go to that idea of a marketplace of ideas, you would see a lot more of targeted investment from the donor class to do that. But I didn't know any of that. And that makes a lot of sense to me now, why academia is so populated with folks like this. You know, Paul, I was asked to sit in the Aspen Rodell Fellowship when I was elected treasurer. I'd come from the private sector, and, you know, Aspen Rodell selects 12 Rs and 12 Ds every year, and you go for 3 years for a weekend, and you study founding documents and great literature. And the people that were most hostile in that room to the American Constitution were the Harvard Law School graduates. It was the first time that I'd ever heard any of Howard Zinn's type of view of America, that the founders were racist and wrote the founding documents so that they could maintain the institution of slavery. I was shocked that these Harvard men and women were so aggressive on this. And now you've seen this across the country, and it's not only at the law school or the graduate schools, it's in their undergrad programs, and it's unfortunately in many of our public universities outside of Arizona as well.
You know, Henry, I agree with the governor on this point, which is I've been around education for a long time as well, and certainly not as much as the governor, because in being governor, that's part of what you do. You run schools. But this argument hasn't really been made very well. What's fascinating about that is, as the governor said, part of what's going on with the Ken Griffins of the world is they're upset about what's taking place with this whole cancel culture and the issues of anti-Semitism. But recognizing that group recognizing that part of what's taking place is you have these elite schools who have a strong orthodoxy towards how it is that professors are going to be taught, and it's professors who then believe in these extreme ideas that are teaching the next group of professors. You know, here's a number that I find to be fascinating. The Red Scare. Most of us remember that. Well, we may not have remembered living through it, but we knew from our history book what happened with McCarthy, the idea that McCarthy was out calling everybody a communist. And finally, the nation reacted to that. One of the groups that he was accusing of that were academians. He said there are all these academians that are socialist. The country stood up and took a position after they'd fired 65 professors for being a socialist. And they said, hey, we need to be tolerant of other ideas. Those ideas should be able to exist there. And they allowed them in. Now, here's what's fascinating. That group, as it's become stronger, they become completely intolerant of a view that surrounds capitalism, a view that surrounds how the American system works. And they, to put a big fine point on this, they fired now 185 professors based upon the concepts of cancel culture. And by the way, most of them in more elite institutions. You know, I saw this Fifth Circuit Court judge that went to speak in Stanford. And it was fascinating because, you know, he has a speech that's prepared. He cut a deal with the dean of the school to give students 5 minutes at the beginning to be rancorous. But then he said, then I need you to control the room because I want to give my speech. Well, of course, she never did, and the room broke out, and they were making all types of accusations about him. They were saying that they ought to rape his daughters, and they were saying horrible things to him. Well, the answer to that, it seems to me, it starts with you were being disrespectful to a Fifth Circuit judge who has something to offer. Number two, you're being disrespectful to the other students. Third, you're being disrespectful to the Constitution. But most importantly, it doesn't seem like you're mature enough to be in this place. I don't know why those kids aren't kicked out. To me, that's an academician, a dean taking a position of saying, this isn't going to be allowed. But I do think that the problem's even worse than that. And that is that we're perpetuating a group of people that are taking any type of alternative thought and cutting it out of the system. Your concept of trying to create a PhD program that works in universities like ASU, where there is a much greater heterodoxy, where there's a much greater ability to disagree, seems to me to be a solid idea.
It's an idea that can't work in isolation, Paul, because academia is an incredibly conservative and elitist profession. As much as they might be left-wing, they are also conservative elitist. And it's going to be very, very difficult to convince any faculty member at any decent university in the United States to hire someone from ASU rather than from Harvard, because of all the prestige and all the networks that are linked with someone from Harvard. And to be perfectly frank, that is a rational decision to hire someone from Harvard because they will be more successful in their career as a professor than someone from ASU because of the backing they have from those powerful people and the training they had at Harvard. So it can't just be done in isolation. I think that it has to be a sort of a systemic move across the whole higher education landscape, and it's going to be difficult to pull off. I actually don't know of anyone who's even trying to do this at the graduate level. But I'm not particularly hopeful that it can be pulled off in isolation just in one place. I wish it could.
So listen, really enjoyed the conversation today. The last thing I'd say that I'm proud of in Arizona, in addition to ESAs, is we were the first state to pass the American Civics Act. So the same test that a newly naturalized citizen takes, nobody graduates from K-12 education. That's step one. Okay, and there's a lot more to do there. And Paul, you talked about math and science, and I agree. I think they're very important. But if you really think about it, what we're doing is we're educating citizens. I think it was actually the German people in the 1930s that had the highest level of STEM training. And look what they were able to fall for. And I think this idea of our Declaration, our Constitution, the American creed of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that our rights come from God and not from the government, and that we believe that every man and every person was created equal. This is the great differentiator for our country. We're teaching this in Arizona. 30 plus other states have done this. But if we can keep focusing on this, I think there's a bright light ahead for our nation. And I'm glad there's such a focus right now on education and what needs to be fixed, because it's an incredibly important component of public policy and quality of life in our nation and around the world.
Governor, thanks for all you've done. Henry.
I just agree with the governor. This is a absolutely existential matter for the future of Arizona as a state where people are moving to. It's really incumbent on the state to show solutions in both K-12 and higher ed. And I think the state is really on a pretty good path, seems to be improving, but obviously there's still more work yet to be done. And I'm kind of happy to be here and spending my career in Arizona, where there are interesting new things being tried out all the time. I'm really enjoying it. So good to see you, Paul, and Governor, thank you for having me on the show.
Thanks again, Henry. Professor Thompson and Governor Ducey, thanks so much for your contribution today. You know, the optimistic news that we have is that everyone on this show today believes in education. We understand the role that it plays in developing a better society, the role that it plays in economic development, and how it is that we need to make certain that civics is being taught and that we put a focus on math and science. I think all of us want to ensure that parents have a choice. Now, we had some disagreements. Certainly one of the disagreements was on the issue of testing and on the issue of vouchers. But overwhelmingly, one thing that I know is I believe that the governor and Henry, while we may have disagreements on a variety of issues, that we still come from a good place. To me, the most important thing in our country is to actually respect the idea that people can have differing ideas from you and still have good intentions, still trying to accomplish a good goal. The most important thing that I love always hearing from the governor and that I love hearing from Henry is the importance of the free market, the importance of focusing on those civil rights that came to us all the way back from our Constitution. Not only civil rights, equal rights, and human rights, but property rights and free markets. Those are all things that were guaranteed to us through the Constitution, and they have developed an amazing society. Now, for us to be able to get to the next level, education is just quite simply going to have to be at the top. We'll spend more time in the future talking about this very important issue, but it was fun doing that today with the governor and Henry to try and figure out where it is that we're going and what it is that we need to do. Now, if you like the work that we're doing, I always recommend press that subscribe button, become a part of our community, or you can go to optamerican.com/premium and become one of our premium members to cut out all the commercials. Thanks again for being here. Paul Johnson with the New Frontiers, sponsored by the Optimistic American.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.